So I had a conversation today, and I thought it would be interesting to share the outcomes of said conversation because it kind of connects to a couple things that have happened. So if you haven't heard, there was a leak on Google with Project Veritas exposing the biases of Google. It brings a larger complication to the table because there's a couple things at play here, and I wanted to cover them both in a way that kind of makes sense. But first, let's start with the foundations of this principle.
Oh, yes, in. We've got a big case here. Where have you been?
I want to start with the first concept. Why do we have a First Amendment? That's a question I asked a few people today, and I got the same answer. So we can have freedom of speech, so that we can say what we want. That's not the purpose of the First Amendment. It may become to a shock or a surprise to you that the philosophy behind the First Amendment runs deeper than we wanted freedom of speech and protection of the press. Think about it this way. When our country was founded, it was under the feudal lords of England, France, Spain, and a few other countries. All run by monarchies. They didn't have any type of democratic system. It was all do what the crown says. So what do you think what happens when a ideology or a monarchy comes into power? What's the first thing they usually try to control? Dissident. Anybody that speaks against the crown is executed. That's called treason in their books, punishable by death. What about Christianity? Heresy. Blasphemy. Those two terms should be very familiar with everyone at this point in time, thanks to Islam. Those were punishable by death. You were killed for speaking against God. You were killed speaking against Allah. You were killed for speaking against the church. You were killed for speaking against the caliphate or Muhammad or whatever. The punishment for dissident action was death. Thus spawned the First Amendment. It was the Founding Fathers' principle, mind you, not just because they codified it into law. The principle behind the First Amendment is to allow voices to speak, especially those that speak ill of king and country. This is to say that those that speak against the government are definitely allowed to speak. This is why in our country, hate speech is free speech. A lot of people hate that concept. That's because they don't like the fact that people disagree with them, and so the only thing left is to call each other names. It descends into petty, childish antics, and then we're ending up in the situation we're in right now. Now, moving on to Google. Apparently, they seem fit to prostate and put their moral superiority upon everyone else. Because I've noticed, even in a book I read called Moral Politics, that the person that wrote the book clearly is a liberal person who thinks the liberal moral values are superior. In fact, he writes so much in his book, which irritates the shit out of me. If you're doing a direct comparison between conservative and liberal values, you don't say one's better than the other just because, and you find it morally superior. No, it's a pure contrast based on moral frameworks. Which one works better, which one works least, which one's different from one another, you keep your personal opinion out of it. This author, on the other hand, in the book called Moral Politics, I put it out there again, he decided to emphasize that the liberal logic and values is better than conservative ones. Reasons. That's all he gives, is reasons. It's better because it's better for a majority or some shit. Not true in the least sense. Actually, a combination of the two is probably better than most, but it's not one or the other. I digress. That's a little bit into the weeds. The point being that Google has decided to slant itself on one particular side of this ideology. And because they are not government, they are not beholden to follow or enforce the First Amendment. They don't have to. Why? Because for some strange reason in this country, and I still don't understand why, there's plenty of case law to back it up, organizations are people too. They have the same rights and privileges as other people within this country. Meaning that an organization has freedom of speech, freedom to the press, freedom to right to assemble. They have the freedom of due process. As if a company can be guilty of murder. Wouldn't it be individuals that are guilty of murder and not the company? Unless, of course, the company is a, arms dealer. Then maybe. Doesn't make sense to me, but, I digress. Again, the idea and the principle behind the First Amendment stands that because we have voices that we do not like, the government cannot stop those voices. That was the purpose. To allow people who hated the government be able to speak up against the government. The idea of the government would then be listen to those voices and then react appropriately, because clearly there's something going on here that we don't like. Maybe get to the bottom of it. Maybe it's fruitless. Maybe it's pointless. Maybe it's just them being irritated because they don't like authority. I mean, there's a billion reasons why they might speak up. But generally, true grievances were allowed on purpose. Corporations are not beholden, as I've said. Well, that's because they have not adopted American principles. They said, well, this is the letter of the law. The fun part about this is one thing I've always said about organizations in particular is that they are unethical by nature. Whatever they can get away with, they will. Why? Because economy and markets and money and the idea of making a profit has no moral values. Zero, in fact. It is a neutral stance. Its sole purpose is to gain revenue. Any means necessary, in fact. So it kind of aligns with Antifa, ironically. They love anarchy. They align with BAM, by any means necessary. Ironically, by any means necessary, they will turn a profit. That does mean if there's no law, who cares? We'll just do it anyways. Google's moral creed, their motto, if you will, to do no evil, pipe dream. The original founder, maybe, because he saw ahead of time what would happen. Now that they have this power, you got people in place with a moral authority who think they are better than everyone else and know morally better than anyone else, will assert their power and dominance upon others. My point taken that the leaks that we saw in Veritas from Google and whatnot means that they have decided to wield that power in favor of the people that they like. They are not beholden by the government. They have their First Amendment themselves. They are allowed to speak. Plus, they use that as a cudgel to silence others, meaning they have the right to silence others' speech because they're not a government. They don't hold the principles that are the First Amendment. They don't have to. That's their right. So if we regulate them to force them to abide by the First Amendment, what's going to happen? Either they comply or they leave the country. Considering America is probably one of the biggest consumers and they have the foundations here and what's made them fruitful, chances are they'll comply. However, there have been laws and statutes in place that allow them to take their cake and eat it too. They can do both ways. It's a shit system, and that's what we have that we need to fix. Because they've decided to be the moral arbiters of truth. They've decided to be the person that allows people to speak or not, throttle or dethrottle. In fact, I know I've been dethrottled. It's amazing because I can watch my own analytics go straight to shit, and the only thing that helps me is having other people boost my signal at this point. I can't gain things organically because the system is now rigged against me because I don't tote the fucking line. I swear. Oh my God. A doctor that swears. This leads me to my last point. You saw the leaks in Google from Veritas and friends that they are planning to try and rig the 2020 elections through analytics, through their own control, not government control, and because they side with the Democrats firmly, and it's fairly obvious that they do. Now, there is some truth to this and some not, but I want you to consider this. When this narrative about Trump-Russia collusion came about? Where did it get perpetuated from? What evidence do we see of this? Where did this evidence come from, and why did it exist in the first place? The fun part is the first place I saw it even uttered was from Hillary Clinton's mouth. Ironically, everybody toted her line. She had to be the matriarch feminist. They all aligned with her because she was supposed to break that glass ceiling. She totes the same ideological privileges that everybody else does. She's a part of the church. She saw the writing on the walls, and she'd love to control said church. Well, they decided to go along with her, push this narrative, but where's the evidence? It just so happens that they would game the system. They were gaming YouTube to put their anti-Black Lives Matter with their pro-Black Lives Matter narratives up front, in center, to game the system to make it look like these two political heads were fighting each other. It worked quite well because other people caught on and just toted along with it. Facebook, they bought a shit ton of ads, now didn't they? Facebook helped them game the system. Google helped them game the system as well, and so did Twitter, because we had Twitter handles and followings and these Russian bots and Russian trolls that you hear about. Well, there were Russian bots, and they were playing both sides to make us fight each other. It was rather amazing. But who'd allowed it? Where did this evidence come from? How did it exist? I would say that the platforms that seem to think they can control the narrative are complicit as well in the narrative and the control. Of course they allowed it. One was saying what they wanted. The other one wasn't saying what they wanted. Well, they banned the one side, but they didn't fix the other. Russia just played both sides, right? Assuming that they were right in the first place, that they existed in the first place. But I would argue that they helped aid and abet the Russians.
But he began it all, though. It's his fault.
If the Russians actually did anything at all, which is they bought ads. They ran their shit on Facebook. They ran their shit on Google. They ran their shit in YouTube. They put it on Twitter. These people helped the Russians try to rig the elections. They are culpable in this. Now, do you think they'd be held to account? No. Actually, what I think should happen is quite the opposite. The power that they willed at this point to control the narrative, to control people's speech, to fix the algorithm so only certain things shows up and other people get silenced, because they think they have the moral authority to silence voices because they feel it's their moral obligation to do so, which is ironic, thinking morally from a company that's all about profit, which is immoral in general. Not to say amoral, but immoral. They will violate ethics to turn a profit, is what I'm saying. They don't necessarily have to follow. The only reason that laws exist and regulations is to stop companies from acting immorally and hurting people. Well, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth are now acting immorally in the name of their own ideology, which they think is moral. How twisted is that? They're culpable. They're just as guilty, in my opinion, of this Russian narrative as everyone else. Why? Because they ignore the First Amendment. They don't understand the principle. They think they can silence one voice and amplify another because it suits their narrative. But that's not the principle of the First Amendment. As I said from the beginning, so that everybody understands, the principle of the First Amendment, the thing that actually put the First Amendment in place, is the Founding Fathers sat down and said, this type of power to wield, to say that dissonant voices, those that decide to speak up against the government, can be squashed by the government, is why the king loses, is why the French lost, is why Spain is a shit stain. They think they can control the narrative because their monarchy controlled speech. As I said before, speaking against crown and country earns you a chopping block. America and our founding fathers said, what has every dictator, every vile piece of shit in our history of our entire planet, Hitler and Stalin included, Mao included, have tried to do every single time they seized power? Control the narrative. Silence dissonant voices. Look at Venezuela right now. What happened when people were speaking out and reporting what the hell was happening? The Maduro's trucks running over protesters. He shut off CNN. He shut off CBS and ABC and NBC. He shut off all media from broadcasting shit out of his country. Controlling the voice for power. So this is now what Google owns and holds, along with YouTube, with Facebook, with Twitter. They have the power. They know they have the power. And because they think they're morally right, they're going to wield it. Consider that for a while, and I hope somebody at Google listens to this. There's plenty of ways to fix it. The best way is stop using the power. Let it go. You want to be morally right again? Step away from it. This is a sword that you should not wield. I hope you enjoyed this video. Gave you some food for thought. I thought it was quite interesting. It was a conversation I had today, and I thought I'd share. So, I'll see you next time.
Haven't you heard of me?